monitoring and activating your video.
Alrighty. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. One thing I can assure you is that this evening you will walk out a happier person from this lecture, which I don't say often about lectures, especially considering how heavy the topics have been. But this one will surely leave you with some practical tips, and we'll leave you a happier person, because we'll be speaking about a psychology Nobel laureate, but with that come a lot of the greatest, a discussion of some other great Jewish psychologists and some of their lasting tips for happiness. So it's interesting. The theme of these classes is Nobel winners, but there's actually no Nobel Prize for psychology. There's no Nobel Prize for psychology, and there is a Nobel Prize for economics. So Daniel Kahneman, who I'm going to speak about, is a psychologist, but he won the Nobel Prize in economics because of his discoveries that have so many implications for economics. So really, he gives a voice to many other Jewish psychologists. Yeah. And there's a few things that are unique about Daniel Kahneman's winning of a Nobel. First of all, is that it's in economics and he's a psychologist. That's one thing that's outstanding. The other is that usually the Nobel Prize is only given to someone who's alive. They'll never give a prize to someone who's no longer alive. And his partner in who I'm going to speak about, his partner in his discoveries, Amos Tversky, passed away. But because the prize was being awarded to Kahneman, who was alive, they also gave it to his partner in a way. They mentioned his partner who is no longer alive. So in that way, the Nobel that Kahneman gets is unique because it's also in a field that is usually there's no Nobel for, and it's also given honoring his partner Amos Tversky. The other unique thing, which I think is worth exploring about his Nobel, is we speak a lot about the high rates of Jews who receive Nobels. In economics, 40% of the recipients are Jewish, and in other fields, the average is about 25%. And unfortunately, the number of Israelis receiving Nobel Prizes is extraordinarily low. When you compare Jews living in Israel to Jews in the diaspora, the number is very low. What you want to make of that, I don't know. Is it a bias against Israel? Probably, because besides for people like Yitzhak Rabin, Menachem Begin, who, by the way, we'll speak about next week, who received Peace Nobel Prizes, others in the fields of science do not receive that many. There's only 0.7% in sciences from Israel, and and from Sweden, which is where the whole thing happens, it's like they come in fifth. So there obviously is a bias there. So that's just another thing that's unique. So what's unique about Kahneman is that he's originally from Israel, but then he went to Princeton and other places. So in his prize, he also brings pride to Israelis, which are clearly underrepresented in the Nobel Prizes. So what did Daniel Kahneman get his prize for? I'll read on Alan's suggestion. I'll read what he got his prize for. So the decision reads, Daniel Kahneman has integrated insights from psychology into economics, thereby laying the foundation for a new field of research. Kahneman's main finding concerned decision-making under uncertainty, where he has demonstrated how human decisions may systematically depart from those predicted by standard economic theory. Basically saying that even though we're all smart creatures, our economic decisions are not necessarily always wise, and we're going to go through some of the ways in which we are either misled or make mistakes. So that's a field that he explored together with Amos Tversky, is how people make economic decisions that are not rational, and how knowing about some of these blunders can help you. But before we go on, of course, we have to speak about Jews and psychology, because I cannot think of another field that is more Jewish in terms of its founders and just the big rock stars, the greatest in the field than psychology. I mean, obviously you have Freud, you have some really great Jewish psychologists, Freud, Adler, Martin Seligman. There's many more. So there's a lot of people who are founders of psychology who are Jewish. In fact, as Rabbi Sachs said, If you look at all the founders of psychology from Freud's generation, they're all Jewish except for one. And as Rabbi Sachs said, and even that one is probably because he didn't figure himself out yet. But there's just a lot of Jews in terms of the founders of the psychology as we know it. And there's actually a deep connection. There's a very strong connection. What ideas can you think about that are in our faith that lead you to some of the conclusions that the fathers of psychology have discovered? So, for example, the idea that we have a Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Ra. We have a good inclination and a bad inclination. That's a very Jewish idea. And then Freud famously said there is a id, an ego, a super ego, where basically the id is your animalistic Yetzer Hara, and the ego is your more reasonable side, and the super ego is deciding, the idea of sort of the free choice in the middle. Interestingly, a lot of these ideas are even stronger in Kabbalah and Chassidut. So in Chassidut, there's this whole concept where human beings have different types of souls, different levels of souls. You have the nefesh behemit, which is like the animal soul, just like a horse has a soul that lets it, walk and run and make decisions. So do humans have. And then there's the nefesh elokit. There's the godly soul that distinguishes human beings. So all these ideas are found in psychology, but previously in Judaism. And it's interesting. I thought this was like some kind of urban legend that they say, but no, it's true. Freud was fascinated by Jewish mysticism. He owned a copy of the Zohar translated into German. There's a whole paper from someone in NYU about it. And he really was fascinated by it. Her name is Jessica Weiner from NYU. She wrote about the difference between the public Freud and the private Freud, and how the private Freud was much more interested in Judaism and fascinated by it. So that's just another example of something that Judaism definitely inspires the field of psychology. There's an excellent story told by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs that he heard from Elie Wiesel, who we spoke about. He says Elie Wiesel once told him the following: Sigmund Freud and Theodor Herzl lived in the same neighborhood in Vienna. All these great founders of psychology were from the Vienna area. And so he says, Elie Wiesel told me once that thank God this Herzl man and Freud, who lived in the same area in Vienna, did not meet each other. Why, thank God? Why is it good they never met each other, Alan? Because he says, if Herzl would have come to Freud and said, I have this dream, there's going to be a Jewish state in the land of Israel. The Jews will return to their ancient homeland, and there will be a Jewish state with the Jewish people and everything. Freud would probably say, okay, I have a couch in my office, and why don't you come and talk to me about it, and I'll help cure you from your from whatever insanity has gone through your mind and this madness that the Jews might have a state one day. So Elie Wiesel said, thank God that even though they lived close to each other, Herzl and Freud never ended up meeting with each other. So that's just in terms of who was there in Vienna. Another very fascinating concept is the concept of projection, which today we take for granted, but it's really Freud who coined it. The idea of projection is that you say something to someone, or someone says something to you, and instead of it reflecting what they mean about someone else, it actually is what's in their own heart. And it's interesting, so for example, someone says to someone, oh, you look exhausted. And really, they're often just talking about their own state of mind. And so it's interesting because there's in the beginning of the book, I remember when my undergraduate major was psychology. I told this to the professor, he was so happy. It says in the beginning of the book of Chumash Dvarim, in the beginning of the book of Devarim, it says that God speaks to the Jewish people, and the Jewish people turn to God. They're always complaining, and they say, God, you took us out of Egypt because you hate us. And Rashi comments, this is often done where someone says to someone what they think about them. So when the Jewish people are speaking to God, and when they say to God, you hate us, that's why you took us out of Egypt, it was actually, now, obviously God doesn't hate anyone, But that was obviously, they were at their distressed time speaking their mind of what they thought of God, of what their, what their feelings were at the time. So actually, the idea of projection is very much found in Rashi long before Freud showed up. The idea that when the Jews say to God, you hate us and that's why you're doing this, that was actually, long before Freud. Now, the most brilliant idea on Freud and Judaism comes from Rabbi Sachs, and I'm going to share it with you if it's okay. Does anyone know what a Freudian slip is? A Freudian slip is basically when someone says something one way as a mistake, but they actually mean that. It's a revealing statement, right? It's they say something that's a revealing statement. It's almost like the idea of projection, but you don't mean to say that. It sometimes happens when someone says something and they by accident say something, but that's actually what they meant. It wasn't that the accident wasn't that they said it. The accident was that they revealed what was on their mind. So Sigmund Freud is in his old age, he's world famous, and he's living in Vienna. And the year is 1938. And Nazism is on the rise. And Sigmund Freud writes his last book. His last book, the last book that Freud wrote is called Moses. It's about Moses. Now, at this time, Nazism in Austria is on the rise, and Freud's friends are trying to get him out of Vienna to come to London, and he refuses. He will not leave. And it's not until the Gestapo take his daughter Anna and investigate her that he's able to be persuaded to leave. But until then, he refuses to leave, even in 1938 when his friends tell him to come to London. So eventually he's taken to Vienna, and that's where he spends his last months, years. How much? To London. I'm sorry, he's taken to London, and that's where he spends the last time. Now, in this book that he's writing at the time, he argues, he says Moses must be an Egyptian. Why? He says, because who would agree to leave the royal palace of Pharaoh with all the privileges that entails and become a slave and a member of a nation of slaves? Must be an Egyptian. So you see where this is going. So Rabbi Sachs says very brilliantly, think about when Freud is writing this. He's writing this at the time of the rise of Nazism, and it's at the time where so many Jews tried to be true Germans and true Austrians, but were rejected. And so in a way, Freud is talking about himself, meaning if he had the option of assimilating into the more powerful culture, he would have. Had he had the option of being a complete German Austrian, he would have. And what he needed to understand is that it's so much more valuable to be the member of the nation with merit rather than the nation with power. And what he didn't understand about Moses is that it's a much more powerful thing to join a nation of slaves, which has a belief, an identity, and a moral high ground, than to be part of an enslaving Egyptian nation. And so what Freud didn't understand about Moses is that merit is much more important than power. And so he should have understood that. And in a way, Rabbi Sachs goes into this in more detail, how it's a Freudian slip, and really Freud is writing about himself wanting to join the dominant German culture, just like he would have wanted Moses to join the Egyptians. So I thought it's a brilliant analysis of the greatest analyzer of Freud. So that's what he didn't understand. He didn't understand that it's much better to identify with the nation that thinks that might does not make right.
Did he ever deny his Judaism?
You know what? In that sense, you have to give it to him. He didn't deny his Judaism, and in a way, it didn't matter that much. Meaning, there have been those who were baptized or whatever, but he didn't deny his Judaism. But his last book is very critical of Moses, and he wasn't, let's say, a proud Jew the same way Albert Einstein was. But yeah, no, he was. We shouldn't hate on him, more than he deserves. Meaning, he wasn't. He didn't get himself baptized. He didn't go anywhere else. But in the same time, in Vienna, there's another Jew living. This Jew's name is Viktor Frankl. Has anyone heard of Viktor Frankl? So Viktor Frankl is a young Jew, and he's a huge fan of Freud. He writes him fan mail, and he goes to medical school. He becomes a neurologist and a psychiatrist. And here's a very fascinating story I didn't know. He later becomes one of the most famous fathers of psychology. It's Vienna, and the Nazis are coming in. And Frankl has a visa to the United States, which can save your life. And he doesn't know, should he take the visa or not? But his parents, his older parents, are living in Vienna. So he doesn't know. He's torn. Should he go to the safe United States? Or should he stay in Vienna to take care of his parents? He comes to visit his parents, and he hasn't made his decision, but he knows this is his last. He's making the decision now. He comes to his father's house, and he sees a huge piece of marble, broken marble stone on the table. He tells his dad, "What is this?" And his father says, "This is a piece of marble that I've taken from the synagogue. The Nazis came into the big synagogue in Vienna, and they defiled it, and they smashed everything. And you know, above the ark, there's 10 commandments, a tablet of the 10 commandments. They smashed this, and I just felt I couldn't leave it on the streets of Vienna, so I took this piece of marble." And he looks at his father, and he says, it's not the full 10 commandments. He says, "What does it say here?" He tells him, it says, "Kabed et avicha ve'et imecha." Honor your parents so that your days shall be lengthened. And that's when Viktor Frankl decides to stay in Vienna. He stays in Vienna, and it does not go well. He ends up being taken by the Nazis. He ends up in the concentration camp of Auschwitz. And this is where he becomes the father of positive psychology. He looks around him, and he realizes that the only people who are surviving, the only way to survive, is if you will believe there's going to be a bright future, or if you see meaning to your life. And he stands outside. They have those harrowing, where everyone stands at 5 a.m. in the freezing cold for hours. They have these harrowing, I'm not sure what the word for it is. Roll calls. And they're standing out there in the freezing cold. And he realizes the only way he is surviving is by imagining himself speaking about this experience to a future medical school class, him lecturing about it. He realizes the only way he's surviving this is by telling himself, "I'm not here, I'm actually living this for the future." And he then becomes the author of a very famous and great book, a must-read, called Man's Search for Meaning. And he realizes that psychology is not just about fixing problems. It's not just about making sure that if someone suffers from something that you need to cure it, but it's about developing something positive, about finding meaning, looking into the future, being optimistic. And this is when he becomes the father of modern positive psychology. Now, the parallel to Jewish history is obvious, right? Throughout the generations, Jews always kept the eye future. In Hatikva, Ein Letzion Sophia. What does Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai tell Vespasian when he gets out of Jerusalem and the temple is being burnt and destroyed? What does he tell him? He tells him, "Ten li Yavne v'chachamea." Give me the study hall, Yavne, the yeshiva, and the wise people so that I can rebuild. It's always been for the Jewish people about rebuilding. It's always about looking forward. And so similarly, you say, what do you say at the end of the Seder? Next year in Jerusalem, right? L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. It's always about looking forward. And so that's really what Viktor Frankl did. He took this idea of Judaism, of looking forward, and he taught it to the world. It's interesting. The prayer of Aleinu L'Shabeach is very ancient. When did we start saying it on a daily basis?
15th century.
During the Crusades in Ashkenaz, when Jews suffered tremendously under the Crusades and life became almost unbearable, the rabbis knew that the only way to pull through this is Aleinu L'Shabech, by praising God and knowing that there's fortune and blessings to being Jewish. And that's what Viktor Frankl taught the world. He taught the world about the need for meaning. There's really, he really changed the world, and he's considered the father of positive psychology.
Did he survive?
Yeah, he survived, and he wrote the book. He moved to America, And he's the father of positive psychology, in the sense that psychology until him only looked to cure problems, to be like, okay, what can we do in this situation? And he was like, no, we need to look at, at what drives people, what helps people be resilient, what helps people look forward and overcome difficulties. That's what he did. Okay, so that he's the father of psychology in that sense. And building on his work, there's a fellow who happens to be alive today. There aren't many people who are, such legends in their field and are alive today, but one of them is a Jewish person, lives in Pennsylvania. His name is Martin Seligman, and he also pioneered this field of happiness, the need for finding meaning, happiness. His famous formula for happiness is called PERMA: positive emotion, engagement, relationships, and meaning. So really the only way to thrive, his book, the name of his book is Flourish, actually a very good book, is to really find meaning, to find relationships, to find something that engages you, something that you do that really is meaningful to you. And he's hired by the US military sometimes. He worked in West Point to really find the strengths, the soldiers. I actually have a friend in Israel that trains soldiers in really difficult situations. He trains them for, to be top units. And he said, it's not physical strength. You can have a guy who's 7 feet tall and really all muscle. And then you can have a guy who's 5'5" and not very strong. And he said it does not depend on physical strength. Becoming a top soldier depends on your determination, your resiliency, your ability to overcome difficulties, and you're seeing meaning in what you're doing, right? If you're very strong, but you see no meaning in what you're doing, it's not going to help. So this idea is obviously a very, very Jewish idea. And not just that fields of childhood psychology. There's a very famous woman named Margaret Muller. She also escaped the Nazis and ended up in England, in America. Abraham Maslow, for those of you who know the Maslow triangle of basically what our most basic needs are and what our more advanced needs are. Melanie Klein, child psychology. Daniel Goleman today. Has anyone ever heard of the term EQ versus IQ? So IQ is intelligence. EQ is like your emotional intelligence, right? When someone comes over to you and smiles at you and says, hi, you're polite, right? That emotional intelligence, the ability to be, to deal with people nicely. So that's another field. So basically the founders of really all branches of psychology are Jewish. And the reason for that is, of course, because many of these ideas are extremely Jewish, and both from Jewish sources and Jewish history. Now, let's go to Mr. Kahneman, and I love this story. So Daniel Kahneman is born, first of all, for those of you who recognize the name, there's a very famous rabbi named Rabbi Shlomo Yosef Kahneman, who founded the Panovich Yeshiva in Israel, many post-Holocaust institutions. He's a great rabbi, a Lithuanian rabbinic family. So this is his nephew. And Mr. Daniel Kahneman was born in Tel Aviv in 1934 while his family was on a trip. I don't know how that works, by the way. His mom was in Israel and she had a baby there, and then they moved back to France. The Holocaust begins when he's 7 years old, and there's a curfew for Jews at 6 o'clock. Now, Jews had to wear on their shirt a yellow star. He goes to play at the home of a friend who is not Jewish. And he enjoys the play, and it's fun. And he realizes that the time is up. It's after 6. Now, this is, the Nazis enforced this curfew. There's no playing around with it. And he's terrified. He doesn't know what to do. So he takes his shirt that has his sweater that has the yellow star. He turns it upside down, and he starts walking very quickly in the street to go home. Suddenly, walking in one of the streets, a Nazi soldier sees him. Not just a Nazi soldier, but with, the SS, the black uniform. He knows it's bad news. And he walks really quickly, and he suddenly calls him out. He says, come here. He comes over to him, and the Nazi soldier looks at him. Now, he didn't see the yellow star because it was inside his shirt. And he hugs him and kisses him. And he starts speaking to him fondly in German. And he opens his wallet, and he shows him a picture of his own child. And he gives him money. And basically, right, this Nazi soldier in Paris is missing his own young child, and he didn't know this is a Jewish child, and he gives him money, and he hugs him and kisses him and speaks to him. He didn't know German, so he says a lot of things to him in German. And he says that's when he understood human beings are complicated, right? This is when, this was how he ended up as a psychologist. So, we have some Jewish psychologists being psychologists because of the lessons of the Torah or whatever. Here, he just experienced this crazy experience of a SS soldier hugging and kissing him and giving him money. And here's where he sees human beings can be very different creatures at different times, and he decides to understand that more. So that experience leads him later. He survives the Holocaust, and eventually he moves to Israel. He joins the Israeli army. He goes to Hebrew University, and he even is a member of Israel's negotiating team with the Egyptians in 1975. And we'll speak next week, by the way, again about Menachem Begin. So we'll hear more about Israel and the Egyptians. But Kahneman, he does well for himself in psychology in Israel. And that's when he starts working with his best friend for life named Amos Tversky. Amos Tversky is a very different person than him. Tversky is a Israeli Sabra, and his mom is a member of Knesset, and he's hardcore. His mom is, I think, Mapai, which is the labor party, which was, very strong in the early days of Israel. And they work together, and they come up with some discoveries about how human beings make decisions. And this is where you'll be somewhat entertained. Basically, one of the things that he said to, first of all, when the New Yorker wrote about them, they wrote, this is about Kahneman. This is the person who taught us to think about how we think. So basically, one of the lines that he says is that he discovered how much people make decisions with their body, not necessarily with their mind. And I'll explain. I'm not going to come out saying that we all make very irrational decisions. Actually, you're going to see how a lot of these ways of thinking that we think often save our lives. But we're going to see it's going to be entertaining. But this is what he says. We think not just with our body, also with our eyes. So, for example, I'll just give a small example. If you, if you have, when they show you one letter and then 3 letters afterwards, and you need to complete the word. Or when they play hangman, when they show you a few letters. So if they show you that, they show you, for example, the word. They show you a S and 3 letters after that, and they put a picture of soup. Without even thinking, you're going to say soup as opposed to soap. There's all kinds of things like that where you didn't even think about what you're saying, but your thought was influenced by what you see. Meaning the results of what you said are not necessarily produced by your thinking part. We're going to see, he calls it system 1 and system 2. So basically, system 1 is your thoughts that are like that. You come up very quickly. It's immediately. The example he gives, Alan, 2 + 2, what comes to your mind? 4. But if I told you 12 times 34, you'd be already using system 2, right? So system 1 is like what snaps right into your head. It's sometimes we call it intuition. And by the way, it's not a clear line between which decisions you make with system 1 and which you make system 2. Like, where do you draw the line, right? 2 + 2, 4, 4 + 4, 8. But where does it switch over to the other system? And that's so system 2 is really the thinking system. It's where you're using really your deep thinking. But again, if you hear a large explosion behind you, you don't want to use system 2. Yeah. If you have a soldier, that's the whole point of training. If you're an NBA star and you're thinking about whether should I shoot this basketball in the last 2 seconds of the game, if you're a guy who uses system 2 for thinking, you probably should not be in the NBA. Yeah. So don't look at system 1 as some kind of a denigrating negative thing. It's actually the system that saves your life most often. And sometimes it's the thing that does what you need most. A doctor, sometimes a doctor will use system 1 right away. You see a patient come into the ER and you have to make very quick decisions. Those are decisions that often ended up in your system 1. Sometimes, it's going to help to go to system 2, but that's the idea. The idea is and that's why his book is called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. And this is something that he discovered. And each of these systems is really, really vital to our survival. So that's one thing that they discovered. Another thing, I hope everyone finds it as entertaining as I do, is something he calls the anchoring heuristic. So it's a bias that we have. For example, if I come to anyway, we have a volunteer here. Anyone? No. So I say to you, Renee, how many Jews are there in the world? Do you think it's around 50 million? And I asked a lot of people, as opposed to if I said, how many Jews do you think there are in the world? Do you think it's around 4 million? By saying to you, do you think it's around that number? You'll go, most answers are going to be closest to that. That's why synagogues or charity institutions will come over to you and say, do you think we want to donate $180? You know, you might have been thinking of $3, but once they put that number out there, you're already kind of fixed on it. Yeah. So whatever it is, it doesn't have to be with numbers. Do you think the weather tomorrow will be a snowstorm? You're probably not going to say it's going to be a heat wave. You're going to be much closer to that. This is just an interesting concept. The next thing is availability. Very fascinating concept. And that is why we're afraid. When I'll confess, I personally, I grew up in Israel. I'm afraid to swim in the American Ocean. Why? Because growing up in Israel, we didn't know about sharks. There were no sharks in the Mediterranean. Maybe it was too salty. It's a bit saltier than the Atlantic. There were no sharks, but I come here, wait, there's sharks. Now, obviously, it's an irrational fear because, you know, the chances of getting hurt in a car accident on the way you're drowning are many times over larger, but it's what comes to mind. It's why, you know, when there's one terrorist attack in a place, people are freaked out, even if it's statistically less meaningful. So that's just something that it's interesting. One study that he mentions and by the way, these studies, the reason he got the Nobel Prize in economics is because companies use what he discovered all the time. This is like marketing 101. So for example, you come over to someone and you say, you want to buy life insurance? No, not really. But if you come after there's a big terrorist attack in New Zealand, they'll say, do you want to buy life insurance in case you're killed in a terrorist attack? Everyone's buying. Why? It makes no sense. It's completely irrational. It's absolutely ridiculous, right? There was a terrorist attack in New Zealand and the life insurance was covering all cases of death. So why are you saying that? Because of this idea of availability. It's something that comes to your mind. Interestingly, there's a Rashi about it, which is very famous. What do we read on Yom Kippur? The first thing we read on Yom Kippur. What's the parsha we read on Yom Kippur? Acharei Mos. What are the first words? Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe acharei Mos shnei bnei Aharon b'karvasam lifnei Hashem vayamusu. God speaks to Aaron after the sons of Aaron died by coming into the Mishkan with a fire that they were not allowed to use, and they died. And then we go on to hear this beautiful description of what the service on Yom Kippur should look like. So why is there that negative beginning? Why not just say, here's how to do the Yom Kippur service? What's that about? So Rashi says, Ma Talmud Lomar, what's it coming to teach? He quotes, Haya Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says this is compared, Mashal lecholeh nichnas etzlo rofeh. It's compared to a doctor who came to visit a sick person, and he said to him, don't eat old foods, don't sit in a place that doesn't have proper airflow. You know, the doctor gives all this advice. Will the guy listen? Maybe yes, maybe no. But if the doctor says, don't do those things so you don't die like Mr. Schwartz died, then the guy's going to listen, right? So that's why Rashi says, the Torah says, Acharei mot shnei bnei Aharon. He's warning Aaron, do the service of Yom Kippur properly so that you don't die like those. So that's this availability idea that when you use a real example, it obviously gets people to do something more often.
But,
yeah,
you know,
more strongly.
that might be the wrong time to say it because would he really care at that time?
Who, Aaron?
I mean, his two sons
Look,
are dead.
a few things.
And-
First of all, I know. In the case of Aaron, you can wonder, but in the case of later Kohen Gadol's, you have all the Mishnah about warning especially the Tzedukim Kohen Gadol's. There was a whole thing of putting the rope and making sure they did it right. And there was all this controversy around the Yom Kippur service. Mm-hmm. Some people wanted to do it this way, others wanted to do it that way. And so you're right. In terms of Aaron was obviously careful with everything. But in terms of warning generations, that was much more effective. Another thing that has to do, I must say, this is the one I fall for the most. It's called the sunk cost policy. You buy a bag of potato chips that you hate. Yeah? You buy it, you eat a quarter of the potato chips. You don't like it. It's not healthy for you. It's not good for you. Are you going to throw it out? No, I already spent the money, right? It's what people do in casinos to get people. They have you win. They have you spend. Then they have you win something. Listen, I already did it. And it's interesting. The Gemara speaks about it. You know, there's a prohibition of bal tashchit. You're not allowed to destroy food. You're not allowed to destroy something. So one rabbi sees another rabbi throwing out, chocolate or whatever it is. And he says, what do you mean, bal tashchit? There's this prohibition on destroying things. And he says, bal tashchit de gufei adif. You should always remember this. Bal tashchit of your own body is much more important, right? So whenever you have after Shabbat a large piece of chocolate cake that you might eat too much of, which unfortunately I'm guilty of, and you're like, wait, I already spent the money, or I already ate half of it. I might as well eat it already. No. You could just throw it out, right? Even if you spent the money on the bag of bad potato chips, just throw it out.
I'm not frequently, but I occasionally encounter that problem. I buy the biggest bag I can for whatever. Now, unfortunately, it's $5. But I buy the biggest bag, and I get disgusted as I keep. And there's only one solution, and the only solution is you crush it.
You crush it and you throw it out.
And then your desire, it's gone already, but you get just part of it.
Yeah. So it's unfortunately a lot of times we look, our houses are filled with tchotchkes, right? Why do we keep all these tchotchkes that we buy? You went on a trip to Hershey Park. You bought yourself this very useless jug, which anyways you're not going to use because you're waiting to be tovel it in the Kalim mikveh, but you didn't do it in 5 years, but it's still in your house, just taking up space. But you're not going to do it because what do you mean? 5 years ago when I was in Hershey Park, I spent the money, so I know I'm going to get around to this, right? It's why we keep all kinds of junk that we don't want to keep. It's because like, oh, I already spent it. You're not making your money back by not throwing it out. But if you don't want it, if it's not good for you, it's not good for you. So that's this idea of where it's sunk cost fallacy. You think that you're somehow gaining by not doing it. And the next one is something that Rabbi Sachs mentions: framing. The reason he says that so many Jews are in psychology is because a lot of psychology has to do with reframing something. You look at something and you say, well, maybe it's not this, it's that. Who does that in the Torah most famously? Who looks at a situation and says, wait, maybe it's not this, it's actually something else? Yosef, he looks at his brothers. They say, we feel, after a bunch of years and a lot of bad stuff, but they look at him and they say, we're so sorry about what we did to you. We sold you into slavery. And what does he say? Atem chashavtem l'ra. You guys thought of it in a negative way. Ha'elokim chashava l'tova. God thought of it in a good way. And so he reframes it. And that's what the Jewish people have done throughout, right? Jews have always thought of, it's like the famous joke about the Jew. He's on the train, and this conductor or whoever comes on, and it's a policeman, and he says, where are you going to? Minsk. All right. Continues walking. He's laughing his head off. What's so funny? He looks at his friends. I'm actually going to Pinsk, which is right nearby. In his mind, he was kind of the winner of the conversation. And Jews throughout the ages always were able to reframe things. And so that's the idea of being able to frame things. So what's reframing? For example, you tell someone, if you do this, there's a 10% chance that, I'll give an example. Let's say someone says, there's a 10% chance that, I don't know what, something will happen. There's a 10% chance that if someone says, like, if you do this, there's 10% chance a person's going to die and a 90% chance that they're going to live. So if someone goes to the doctor says, I have good news for you. There's a 90% chance you're going to live. Okay, the guy walks home. He's happy. I got good news. Next guy comes to the doctor says, I have sad news for you. There's a 10% chance you're going to die. The doctor said exactly the same thing, right? But how did he frame it? Did he frame it as something positive or did he frame it as something negative? Right? It's always it's like the cup of water, right? What half are you looking at? So people like to look at things and how we frame them. Yes.
Isn't that the same thing with Freud and Moses?
Well, that was more projection. But look, Jews throughout the ages, something I mentioned on Shabbos, where the Jews are being expelled from in Fiddler on the Roof. They're being expelled from Anatevka. Yeah, so things and this is the town of their life. This is where all their community, their friends, everything's here. And so they're packing their belongings. They're about to leave Anatevka. And then one of them says, hey, what do we have in this town anyways? A pot, a pan, a spoon, a hat, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. They're reframing what's going on. They're saying, it's not that bad. What do we have in Anatevka anyways? It's sort of coming to terms with what's going on. Finally, one thing that Mr. Daniel Kahneman continued is he continued that his next field after he did heuristics was happiness, the study of happiness. I told you you're going to leave this place happier. Okay, here we go. So he studied and he found tips for happiness, and he found a very fascinating concept. There's a huge difference between happiness and satisfaction. What do I mean? Let's say someone has you go work in a coal mine, yeah? Which is probably not your dream, right? They have you go work in a coal mine and you're there with the chevra and they're singing and there's good snacks and everyone's dancing. You'll join the dancing. I know you have good ruach. Are you happy at that moment? You are. Are you satisfied with where your life is at? Probably not. Or the flip side, you have someone who got an internship or a job at the top New York law firm. Yeah? They are slaving away. They're working 18 hours a day, tax season, this season, that season. They're working really, really hard. Are they happy? No, they are not happy because they're working 18 hours a day. Are they satisfied with their life? Yeah, what do you mean? I'm working in this firm. There's a very big difference between happiness and life satisfaction. And so it's something that, it's why a lot of times people will immigrate. They'll leave their village, which is comfortable, and they'll come and you'll see them hustling. They're living in Brooklyn with 20 people in an apartment, and they're all hustling. And why didn't he stay in the little town where he had a nice house with a garden? What was wrong with that? Because he had happiness, he didn't necessarily have satisfaction. So there's a very big difference, and it's important to note the difference. You could be happy without satisfaction, you could be satisfied without happiness, and ideally, you want to have both. So that's a very interesting thing that he came up with. Another thing that he came up with, I think it's related to a lot of our Jewish experiences. You go on an amazing vacation, a truly fantastic vacation. You go, it's nice, it's great, you had a really good time. You come back, you land in JFK, they lost your suitcases, you go, you hustle with, I don't know what you call it, customer service, I guess, so whoever's there, the security, the airline, you hustle with them, and then you get on your taxi, it breaks down on the Belt Parkway, you get home after 10 hours, and you're all tired, exhausted. How was your vacation? Terrible. I mean, what a you just had 2 fantastic weeks in Barbados, but all you can remember is that last day. And so it's interesting, he says, the difference in terms of your long-term happiness from a 1-week vacation versus a 2-week vacation is not going to be big. You'll actually probably enjoy more many small vacations than you will a month vacation in the same place. We can the memories that we have, most often based on the last point of it. And that's what stays in our minds. So he says, for example, with medical surgeries, you have your wisdom teeth being pulled. You leave while, it's terribly painful. Oh my gosh, you'll be so mad. You'll never go back to that dentist. But if you sit in the dentist's chair for another 10 minutes, read a magazine, watch a movie, you'll walk out. That was not bad. It's funny. As long as the last 10 minutes were semi-decent, you'll be okay. So it's just interesting to me, especially again, speaking of Judaism, because we have the concept of Yetziat Mitzrayim, Leman Tizkoret Yom Tzitcha Meretz Mitzrayim. We had 210 years of slavery. What do we remember? We remember the slavery, but boy, did we show them in those last months. Wow, the 10 plagues, the splitting of the sea. What do we remember from Egypt? We came out strong. So I think that's a very powerful thing when you speak about the mitzvah of remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim, etc. So that's the story of Daniel Kahneman. Bezrat Hashem, next week, we'll speak about someone who I know is very popular even after his death. And, thank God, actually, Daniel Kahneman is alive. But next week, we'll be speaking about Menachem Begin, the man and the legend. Obviously, he won a Nobel Prize for the agreement with Egypt, the peace agreement, but he had a full life of many, many, many things. And we'll be speaking about him. Anyone have questions, comments, Jewish psychology, nothing? All right. So I'd like to thank everyone who joined us here, everyone who joined us from home, and wishing everyone a happy week. Don't forget to make sure you focus both on happiness and satisfaction. It's interesting. One of the things that Kahneman says is that you have to focus on view. View makes a very big difference. Being able to see nature a lot actually makes a big difference. And the biggest thing that will make a difference to the happiness is the people you're with, being with community, being with family, people that you love. That's what makes all the difference. There's a famous study I like to cite that people who go weekly to synagogue or house of worship have a life expectancy of 7 years longer. And Rabbi Sachs would always say, is it 7 years longer if you go to shul, or does everything just feel like it's 7 years longer? But yes, so spend more time with loved ones, spend time on having nice experiences, and Bezrat Hashem, everyone should be happy, healthy, be well, and only good things for everyone here and all of Am Yisrael. Thank you. Thank you. Good night. All right.